Well, now, good day to you, friends. Seamus here. Thank you for joining me for today's story. And this story is short, it is simple, it is silly, so let's just get right to it. It is called simply The Donkey and His Shadow. It seems that once upon a time, many, many years ago, there was a merchant that lived in a small town on the hillside in the foothills of a large range of mountains. And on this particular day, he needed to do business in a neighboring town, a town that was on the far side of the valley. And this merchant simply did not like to walk, so he found himself a donkey driver and hired a donkey for the day to take him across the valley. Well, the donkey driver had said to him that they would need to leave as early in the morning as possible. But of course, the merchant was very, very important, and he had many, many things to do, and it was much later in the morning than they had hoped before they finally left. Well, off they went. The merchant stepped up onto the block and swung a leg over the donkey and settled himself down, and the donkey driver gave a little cluck, cluck, and off they went, and down out of the town, along the pathway down to the flat, open plains of the valley, and across the valley they went. Well, they had gone on for several hours, and the sun was only getting higher in the sky, and the heat was only getting, well, hotter as the day went on. And bit by bit, it got to the point that the merchant, who was not accustomed to being astride a donkey, got more and more uncomfortable. And finally, shortly after the very height of noon, he turned to the driver and he said, driver, we really must stop. I don't like this. I'm not enjoying this, and I need to step down and rest for a bit. So, of course, the driver stopped the donkey. And the merchant got down from the donkey, and he looked about everywhere he could, and he realized there was not a tree to be seen. There was no shade to rest himself in. In fact, he turned to the driver, and he said, you have taken me to a place where there's no shade. There's no place to rest. What a fool you are. In fact, the only shade that I can find anywhere around here is the shadow cast by this donkey. So I will take my ease. And he sat himself down in that tiny little patch of shade, hoping to get a bit of rest. Well, of course, on the other side of the donkey was the donkey driver. And he had been just as hot as the merchant. He had been just as busy as the merchant. In fact, he was even more tired, for while the merchant had been riding, the donkey driver had been walking the whole long way. And he was very tired and warm, too. So he came around the head of the donkey, and he looked at the merchant, and he said, excuse me, sir, perhaps you could shift over a little bit and make room in the shade for me. Well, the merchant said, I don't think so, my good man. I've hired the donkey. The donkey's made shade. I need to rest in the shade. I'm taking the shade. The driver says, sir, there's enough room for the two of us if you will just simply shift over. I said I've hired the donkey. It's my shade. You can go stand by your donkey and do donkey driver things. The donkey driver turned to him and he said, sir, it's right. You hired my donkey for the day to ride on. That doesn't mean you own my donkey, and whatever shade the donkey might bring is certainly mine, at least to share. Now, move over. Well, words were exchanged, and the merchant got up, and fingers were shook, and fists were raised, and things got a little ugly to the point that these two men, being silly about a patch of shadow, scared the donkey. And the donkey did the only thing he could. He gave a mighty hee-haw, and reared up on his hind legs and dropped himself down and took off like a shot across the valley. Well, the men stood there for a moment, and they watched the donkey running away, and they watched him running and running and running until all they could see was the dust of his trail. And they turned to each other, and they paused for a minute, and they began to laugh, because what else could they do in that situation but to laugh about the foolishness of what just had happened? And they turned their way towards the neighboring village across the valley, and they started to walk. And they walked for many hours. In fact, the sun was just beginning to touch the top of the distant mountains when they finally came up off the valley floor and along the path to make their way up to the neighboring village. And wouldn't you know it, but right outside that village was the donkey, nibbling away happily on some dry grass. Well, the donkey driver took the lead rope, and the two men walked into town. They walked to an end. The driver stabled the donkey, and he met up with the merchant, who invited him to join him for dinner that night by way of an apology for the foolishness that had happened. And the two men sat down, and they shared a meal, and they shared a jug of wine. The merchant went up to his room, and the driver went off to the barn to spend the night with his donkey. Well, fortunately for the merchant, he was able to conclude his business very early the next day, and they set off for home. And for the good fortune of both men, it was a very cloudy day. It was a much more comfortable ride on the way home. And in fact, the merchant, realizing what a fool he had been the day before, would sometimes get down and let the driver ride for a time. And well before dinner time, they made their way back to their own village, and they went off their separate ways. The merchant had paid the driver well for his time. The driver was kind and thanked the merchant, and all was well between them. Well, wouldn't you know it, just a day or two later, they got together again, and they shared a bit of a meal and a laugh. And in time, they got to be great friends. And one night they sat together telling their families the story of how they met. And they realized that in a moment of foolishness, they risked their entire day. But on that other side of that foolishness was a friendship. And I'm delighted to say that the donkey driver and the merchant, and yes, our beloved donkey, they all lived happily ever after. I do thank you for your attention today. Something simple to start your weekend with. Until we meet again, I bid you peace, that you take good care of yourselves and of the people around you. We will see you soon. Cheers.